You found out on an ordinary day. That is how it usually happens. Not through a confrontation, not through an announcement, but through something incidental that arrived while you were doing something else. A photograph, a comment under a post, someone mentioning it casually, assuming you already knew. And in the 2 seconds it took for the information to register, a structure you had spent years building inside your own head came apart. Because the structure had a load-bearing wall in it, and the wall was a single sentence, and the sentence was, "They cannot do this with anyone." Not with you, not with the next person, not with anybody, because the thing that made them unable to commit was inside them and traveled with them and would follow them into every room they ever entered. That sentence was not cruelty on your part. It was not something you enjoyed. It was the only available explanation for years of behavior that otherwise made no sense, and it was, in a strange way, a mercy. It meant the failure was structural rather than personal. It meant you had not been rejected. It meant you had simply been standing in front of a door that does not open for anyone. And then the door opened for someone else, within months, sometimes weeks. With a level of certainty they never showed you across years. That is the thing you are actually dealing with, and it is worth saying plainly before going any further. You are not primarily grieving a person. You are grieving an explanation. The person left a long time ago. What just died is the framework that made their leaving survivable, and the death of a framework produces a very specific kind of disorientation that feels much worse than ordinary heartbreak and is frequently mistaken for it. The framework is gone and something has to replace it. What replaces it in almost everyone, within about 90 seconds of hearing the news, is a much worse sentence. It was me. The problem was never their capacity. The problem was that I was not the person who unlocked it. That sentence is wrong. It is going to feel true for a while, possibly for a long while, and it is wrong, and the rest of this is an account of why. What you are assuming that is not true. Start with the assumption underneath everything, because it is invisible and it is doing all the damage. The assumption is that commitment is a measure of feeling, that people commit when the feeling is strong enough and do not commit when it is not, and therefore the presence of commitment over there and its absence with you constitutes a comparison of how much they felt. That is the entire mechanism of the wound. Commitment is being read as a scoreboard. It is not a scoreboard. Commitment is a behavior, and behaviors are produced by systems, and the system that produces commitment in an avoidant person has almost nothing to do with the intensity of what they feel. Consider what you already know about them. You watched for years a person feel things and not act on them. You watched them have an emotional response in front of you and then do the opposite of what the response implied. You watched intensity arrive and produce distance rather than closeness. You built an entire working model of a person whose feelings and behavior were disconnected, and the model was accurate, and it was the most important thing you learned in that relationship. And then the moment they committed to someone else, you threw the model away and replaced it with the simplest possible one, which is that they must have felt more. That is not reasoning. That is pain looking for a shape. The model you built was correct. Apply it to this. In a person whose feelings and behavior are disconnected, an act of commitment is not evidence about feeling. It is evidence about conditions. Something in the conditions changed, and the conditions are the variable, and the conditions are almost never what the person on the outside assumes. The conditions that actually produce it. So what changed? There are a small number of answers, and they are consistent enough to be almost boring, and none of them is that the new person is better than you. The first is that they were leaving something. This is the most common and the least discussed. An enormous proportion of rapid avoidant commitments occur immediately following the end of a relationship that had become emotionally demanding. The commitment is not the beginning of something. It is the completion of an escape. Moving decisively into a new structure is one of the most effective ways to make a previous structure permanently inaccessible, and for a person whose primary fear is being pulled back into a level of intimacy they cannot sustain, the new commitment functions as a door being closed behind them. That is not romance, that is architecture. And it looks identical to romance from outside, which is why it is so devastating to witness. The second is that the new configuration demands less. This is not an insult to the other person, and it should not be turned into one. Different people require different amounts, and the amount they require is not a measure of their worth or their depth. But it is a variable, and it is the single most predictive variable in whether an avoidant person can sustain a relationship. You required something, not something excessive. You required consistency, some emotional presence, some indication that you were being thought about, some willingness to talk about what was actually happening between you. Those are ordinary requirements. And they were, for this particular nervous system, above threshold, not because they were large, because the threshold was low. If the next person requires less, or requires it differently, or has a life structure that naturally produces distance so that the distance does not have to be manufactured, then the defense is not triggered at the same rate, and a system that is not being triggered can do things it could not do before, including commit. The third is timing, and timing is more powerful than anyone wants to believe. Avoidant patterns are not fixed at a constant intensity across a lifetime. They intensify under stress and relax under stability. A person in their early 30s with a chaotic living situation and an unresolved family relationship and a job that is consuming them is running a much hotter defense than the same person 4 years later with those things settled. Nothing about their character has changed. The load has changed. If you had them during the hot period and someone else has them during the cooler one, the difference in behavior can be dramatic, and it belongs entirely to circumstance and not at all to the quality of the person in front of them. The fourth is external structure. Sometimes the commitment is not chosen so much as arrived at, a living arrangement that made sense practically, a pregnancy, a visa. A shared business, a family expectation with enough weight behind it. Avoidant people frequently do better inside a structure that was established by circumstance than inside one that has to be built through repeated acts of emotional choosing, because the structure removes the requirement to keep electing the relationship, and the requirement to keep electing is where they fail. None of those four has anything to do with you. Read them again if you need to. Not one of them contains a comparison. The thing you actually did that made it harder. There is a harder truth here, and it is not the one you are afraid of. It is not that you were insufficient. It is something more specific and considerably more useful. You reached them. That is what made it harder. Something in that relationship went further than they were prepared for. You are the kind of person who gets past a defense, not through force, but through the ordinary operation of being genuinely present with someone. You paid attention. You noticed things about them that nobody notices. You created conditions in which a guarded person accidentally revealed more than they intended, and the revealing felt good in the moment and terrifying afterward. That is not a failure. That is the thing you do. And in a person who can tolerate being known, it produces one of the best relationships of their life. In a person who cannot, it produces a threat response proportional to how close you got, which means the intensity of their withdrawal was not a measure of your insufficiency. It was a measure of your reach. Consider it from the mechanism. Avoidant defense activates in proportion to perceived exposure. A person who barely knows them produces almost no activation. A person who is somewhat close produces a moderate amount. A person who has seen the thing underneath, who has been present during a moment when the guard fully dropped, who understands them in a way that cannot be ununderstood, produces the maximum. You were in the last category. That is why it was so difficult. That is why the retreats were so severe. That is why they could not settle with you and could, apparently, settle elsewhere. This is the part that inverts everything, and it takes a while to absorb. The relationship that goes deepest with an avoidant person is frequently the one that cannot survive, and the one that survives is frequently the one that stays above the threshold. It is not that they love the other person more. It is very often that the other person is at a distance the system can sustain. You do not want that. You want to be told you were loved more, and this is not that, and it is better than that. Why their commitment might not mean what it looks like. You are looking at an outcome from the outside and drawing conclusions about an interior you cannot see, and it is worth being precise about how little the outside actually tells you. You are seeing a status, a shared home, a ring, an announcement, a public declaration. Those are structural facts, and they are visible. What is not visible is the quality of the thing inside the structure. Avoidant people can and do enter committed structures while maintaining exactly the internal distance they always maintained. The commitment does not require the distance to end. In many cases, it makes the distance safer, because a formalized relationship removes the ongoing question of whether the relationship exists, and removing that question removes the pressure that used to force periodic emotional contact. This is not a hopeful thought, and it should not be used as one. It is not a prediction that the new relationship will fail, and you should not organize any part of your recovery around that prediction, because it may not fail and because organizing around it keeps you attached to their story. It is simply a correction to the inference. You are inferring from a visible structure an invisible transformation. There is no reliable connection between the two. Plenty of people are inside committed structures with someone who is not fully present, and from the outside those structures look exactly like the ones that are full. You of all people should know this because you spent years inside a relationship that looked, from outside, entirely functional. People who knew you both had no idea. You were managing an enormous amount and none of it was visible. That is how much the exterior tells you, which is almost nothing, and it told people nothing about you, and it is telling you nothing now. The comparison you are running and why it cannot be won. You have been doing something since you found out, and it has probably been running most of the time, and it is worth naming so it can be interrupted. You have been assembling the other person. From fragments, from a photograph, from a name, from whatever small pieces have reached you. And out of those fragments you have constructed a complete person, and the person you have constructed has a specific and impossible quality, which is that they possess exactly the thing you believe you lack. Notice how that construction works. It is not built from information. It is built from your own theory of your own deficiency. Whatever you privately believe was wrong with you is what you have installed in them. If you believe you were too much, they are calm and undemanding. If you believe you were not interesting enough, they are fascinating. If you believe you were too available, they are mysterious. You are not comparing yourself to a person. You are comparing yourself to a figure made out of your own self-criticism, and that figure is designed to be unbeatable, because it is assembled from precisely the qualities you have decided you do not have. There is no version of this comparison you can win, and the reason is that it is not a comparison. It is a self-attack wearing the costume of an observation. The real person is real. They have a job and a family and things that irritate them and some quality that makes them difficult to live with, because everyone has one. They are, in all likelihood, entirely ordinary in the way that everyone is entirely ordinary. And they are almost certainly not receiving a version of this person that would satisfy you, because the version of this person that would satisfy you does not exist and has never existed and was not being withheld from you and handed to someone else. What happens inside that new relationship? For the sake of completeness, and then this subject should be closed, here is what typically occurs. The early period is genuinely good. Avoidant people are often extraordinary at beginnings. The early stage of a relationship has a structural feature that suits them perfectly, which is that it contains no accumulated intimacy and therefore triggers no defense. They can be present, warm, generous, decisive. Everything you saw in the first months with them, they are showing again now, and it is not a performance and it is not fake. It is what they are like before the threshold is reached. Then time passes and intimacy accumulates, because intimacy accumulates automatically, and at some point it reaches the level at which the defense activates. That level is a property of them, and it does not move because of commitment. A ring does not raise the threshold. What happens at that point depends almost entirely on the other person. If they require less, or are content with a certain distance, or have their own reasons for preferring a relationship with some space in it, the configuration can hold indefinitely. Many such relationships last decades. They are not empty. They are just structured around a particular limit that both parties, for their own reasons, do not push against. If the other person begins to require more, which frequently happens as the relationship matures and life events raise the stakes, then the same pattern you experienced begins to appear. Later, more slowly, inside a structure that makes it harder to leave, but recognizably the same. You do not need to know which of these happens. You will probably hear something eventually, and it will land in some way, and it will not change anything material about your life. The point of describing it is only to complete the picture enough that your mind stops filling the gap with the worst available version, the grief that is actually happening. Underneath the comparison and the theorizing, there is a real loss, and it deserves to be named accurately because misnaming it is what keeps people stuck for years. You are not grieving their happiness. You are grieving your own hypothesis. The hypothesis was that with enough patience, enough understanding, enough of the right approach, the closed thing could open. That belief was the engine of everything you did for years. It gave meaning to the difficulty. It made the waiting into an investment rather than a loss. And what has happened now is that the closed thing opened, and it opened without you, and the opening proves that opening was possible, which retroactively converts every difficult year into a failed attempt at something achievable rather than a reasonable response to something impossible. That is the actual injury. It is not about the new person at all. It is that the story in which you were doing something noble and impossible has been rewritten into a story in which you were failing at something possible, and the rewrite feels devastating. The rewrite is false. Here is why. Opening was possible under different conditions. It was not possible under yours, and the conditions were not something you had access to. You could not make yourself require less. You could not go back and meet them 4 years later. You could not remove the stress that was running their defense hot. You could not unreach them. The variables that produced the outcome were structural, and none of them were under your control, and the fact that a different arrangement of variables produced a different outcome somewhere else does not mean your arrangement had a solution you failed to find. Two experiments with different conditions produce different results. That is not a failure of the first experimenter. The question you keep asking at 3 in the morning. Why not me? That is the question in those words arriving at that hour, and it does not respond to argument during the night, and it should still be answered properly during the day. The question contains a hidden premise, which is that there was a decision. That at some point they weighed you against a set of criteria and found you short, and later weighed someone else and found them sufficient. That framing assumes a chooser making choices, and it is the assumption that makes the question unbearable. There was no such decision, not in the sense you are imagining. Nobody sat down and evaluated you. What happened was a nervous system responding to conditions, producing behavior over a period of years. The behavior was not selected, it was generated. And the person generating it experienced it from inside as a series of feelings that arrived in preferences that formed and reasons that seemed compelling at the time, and they would be unable to give you an accurate account of it if they tried, because the mechanism operates below the level at which accounts are generated. So the answer to why not me is that there was no me and not me being compared. There was a situation, and the situation had properties, and the properties produced an outcome. The reason this is worth taking seriously rather than treating as a technicality is that the alternative belief has a very long tail. If you were evaluated and found short, then you carry a deficiency, and the deficiency comes with you into the next relationship, and you will spend that relationship monitoring yourself for the thing that disqualified you. That monitoring is corrosive, and it will make you worse at being loved, not better. There was no evaluation. There is no deficiency being carried. What you carry is a set of requirements which are ordinary and reasonable, and which this particular person could not meet under the conditions in which you knew them. Requirements are not deficiencies. That distinction is the whole thing. What they would say if they could be honest. They will not say it, and it is worth constructing anyway, because your mind is going to construct something, and it may as well be accurate. If they had full access to their own process and were willing to speak it out loud, the account would be something like this: that you were the most real thing that had happened to them. That being with you produced a level of contact they had not experienced before and did not have the equipment to hold. That the intensity of what they felt with you was precisely the reason they could not stay, because the intensity registered in their body as danger, and their body has one response to danger. That the periods of distance were not indifference and were frequently accompanied by more feeling than the periods of closeness, because distance was where the feeling became bearable enough to have, and that the new relationship is not more, that it is easier. That easier is what they can do. That there is a permanent low-grade knowledge in them that they had something with you they will not have again, and that they cannot say this to anyone, and that it surfaces occasionally in a way they immediately suppress because they have a life now, and the life requires the suppression. That account is not offered to give you hope. It should not produce hope because nothing in it is actionable and nothing in it suggests a route back. It is offered because the account your mind is currently generating is that they found someone better, and that account is less accurate than this one, and you may as well hold the accurate one while you wait for the feeling to change. The most common thing an avoidant person says years later about the relationship they left this way is not that they made the right choice. It is that they were not able to do it at the time. That is a different sentence, and it is the true one, and it will almost never be delivered to you. Why their speed was not about enthusiasm. The speed is often the most painful detail. It took them 4 years to not commit to you and 4 months to commit to someone else, and the mathematics of that seems to prove something. It does prove something. It just does not prove what you think. Speed in this context is a marker of low activation, not high investment. The reason they could move quickly is that the new situation had not yet accumulated enough intimacy to trigger anything. Decisions are easy when nothing is being defended against. A person who is not in threat mode can make a large commitment lightly, because the commitment is being made about a future state rather than in response to a present pressure. With you, every step was taken against resistance. Every increment of closeness had to overcome an active defense. That is why it was slow, not because the feeling was smaller, but because the friction was enormous. There is also a pattern worth naming, which is that avoidant people frequently make their largest commitments at the point of least intimacy, early. Before the system knows what it is committing to. Some of them are aware of this about themselves without being able to articulate it, and there is a quality of urgency in it that outsiders read as passion, and that is closer to a race against their own defense. Speed is not devotion. In this population, speed is frequently the opposite. It is the window in which action is possible, and the window closes. The danger of the next 6 months. There is a specific risk in this period, and it should be flagged directly because it is where people lose years. The risk is that you conclude the problem was your requirements and you decide to have fewer of them. The logic is seductive. You required consistency and got nothing. Someone else apparently required less and got everything. Therefore, requiring less is what produces relationships. Therefore, the path forward is to become the kind of person who does not need much. That conclusion will hold up for a while. You may even enter something on that basis and find that it works initially, because relationships with low requirements do function smoothly at the start. And then somewhere in the second year you will discover that you have built a life around a version of yourself that is not you, and that the requirements did not disappear, they went underground, and that they will surface eventually with interest. Requirements are not negotiable in the long run. You can suppress them for a period, you cannot remove them. And a relationship built on their suppression is a relationship that has an expiry date built into it from the first month. The correct conclusion from what happened is not that you should need less, it is that you should find out earlier whether the person in front of you can meet what you need. Same requirements, faster verification. That is the entire adjustment. And the verification does not take years. It takes about 2 months of paying attention to a small number of things, which will be covered later, and which you already know how to observe because you have spent an enormous amount of time observing exactly this. What actually made this take so long? Look back at the arc of it and locate the specific mechanism, because the mechanism is the thing that will repeat if it is not seen. You did not stay for 4 years because you were confused. You stayed because you were on an intermittent reinforcement schedule, which is the most powerful behavioral conditioning pattern that exists. Here is how it operated. Long periods of insufficiency, punctuated unpredictably by moments of extraordinary connection. Not scheduled, not earned, not correlated with anything you did. A weekend where they were completely present. A conversation at 2 in the morning where something opened. A moment where they said something that indicated they saw the whole thing. Those moments were real. That is what makes this so difficult. They were not manipulations and they were not performances. They were what happened when the defense briefly dropped, and they were the truest thing in the relationship, and they were also the mechanism by which you were held in place. Because an unpredictable reward that arrives occasionally produces far more persistent behavior than a reliable one. That is not a metaphor, it is the most robust finding in behavioral psychology, and it applies to every species tested. If you feed an animal every time and then stop, it gives up quickly. If you feed it unpredictably and then stop, it continues indefinitely. You were the second case, and your continuing was not weakness or poor judgment. It was the correct behavioral output for the input pattern you were receiving, and any person with any personality would have produced approximately the same response. That is the most exonerating fact available in this whole situation, and it is worth sitting with. You did not stay because something was wrong with you. You stayed because you were in a conditioning environment that produces persistence in everyone, the fantasy of being the exception. There is something to relinquish here that is larger than the relationship, and relinquishing it is most of the work. You wanted to be the exception, not consciously as vanity, but as a structure of hope. You wanted to be the one who got through. The person about whom they would eventually say, everyone else I could keep at a distance and this one I could not. That desire is not shameful, and it is extremely common, and it comes from somewhere identifiable. People who form this wish usually formed it early, in an environment where love was not automatically available and had to be earned by being remarkable in some way. Where ordinary presence was not enough to secure attention, and so you develop the belief that you must be exceptional in order to be kept. An avoidant partner is the perfect object for that belief because they present exactly the condition it was designed for. Here is someone who does not give love freely. Here is a test that can be passed. Here is the possibility of being the one who was special enough, and the belief kept you there through everything, because leaving would have meant conceding that you were not the exception, and that concession was more painful than the relationship. What has happened now is that the concession has been forced. You were not the exception. Someone else was or appeared to be, and the appearance was enough to collapse the whole structure. Here is what is on the other side of that collapse, and it is better than what was inside it. The desire to be the exception is a desire to be loved for being extraordinary, and love that is contingent on being extraordinary is exhausting to maintain, and it is not actually the thing you want. Because it means that on the days you are ordinary, which are most days, you are not covered. It means the love has a performance requirement attached, and you have to keep meeting it forever. What you actually want underneath is to be loved while being unremarkable, on a Tuesday, in a bad mood, with nothing interesting to offer. That is the real thing, and it has nothing to do with being an exception, and it is only available from people who love ordinarily. which avoidant people specifically cannot do, because ordinary sustained presence is precisely the thing their system cannot generate. So the fantasy was pointed at a person structurally incapable of delivering it. Which means the collapse of the fantasy is not a loss of access to something. It is the removal of an obstacle to something you never had access to while the fantasy was running, what you should not do now. There are several available moves, and all of them cost more than they return, and it is worth naming them explicitly because you will consider all of them. Do not investigate. There is an enormous amount of information available about the new relationship, and consuming it will not answer the question you are asking, because the question you are asking cannot be answered by images. You will look for evidence that it is not real, and you will find some, because every relationship contains ambiguous material, and the evidence will produce 20 minutes of relief followed by a worse state than before. The looking is a compulsion, not an investigation, and it has no terminal condition. Do not contact them. The impulse will arrive dressed as something reasonable, usually as a desire for closure or a wish to say something generous. It is neither. It is the last attempt to be present in a story you have been written out of, and it will produce either silence or a kind response, and both outcomes are worse than not knowing. Do not contact the other person. This does not need extensive argument. It never goes the way it is imagined, and it converts you permanently into a character in their story rather than the protagonist of your own. Do not construct the collapse. The story in which the new relationship fails and they realize what they lost in return is the most compelling piece of fiction your mind will ever produce, and it is fiction, and it will occupy as much of your life as you allow. It may even come true in some partial form eventually, and the partial form will not be what you imagined, and by then you should be somewhere else. Do not perform. The urge to be visibly thriving, to make sure the news of your excellent life travels back, is a form of continued participation. Building a life to be seen by a specific audience is the same as building it for their approval, which is what you were doing before. Build it for yourself and let it be unobserved. The thing to do instead. The practical answer is unglamorous, and it is the only one that works. Reduce the information flow to zero, not partially. Zero. Every fragment restarts the process, and the process is what is consuming you, not the underlying fact. The underlying fact is static, and it has already happened, and it cannot hurt you again. What hurts is each new arrival of it, and the arrivals are largely within your control. This means unfollowing, muting, and telling the 2 or 3 people in your life who have access to this information that you do not want to receive it. That last conversation is uncomfortable, and it takes 90 seconds, and it will save you months. Most people will comply immediately and be relieved to be told, then occupy the capacity, not with distraction, which does not work, but with something that requires the same quality of sustained attention you were spending. Your attention is trained to track a complex thing over time. It will find work whether or not you assign it, and if you do not assign it, it returns to the only job it knows. Give it something difficult and ongoing, and then wait, which is the part nobody wants to hear. The initial acuteness of this fades on a timeline that is not responsive to insight. Understanding it perfectly does not accelerate it much. What accelerates it is the accumulation of days in which you did not check, did not rehearse, did not construct. Each of those days is small and they compound. There is a specific marker to watch for. At some point you will receive a piece of information about them and notice that your body did not change, not suppressed, actually did not change. That is the state arriving, and it arrives later than you want and earlier than you fear, and it arrives without announcement. What this taught you that nothing else could. There is something available here that is genuinely valuable, and it is not a consolation prize, and it is worth extracting deliberately rather than hoping it arrives on its own. You have now seen with complete clarity that a person's behavior toward you is not a measurement of your worth. You knew that intellectually before. Everyone does. What you have now is the experience of it, which is entirely different. You watched the same person produce 2 radically different behaviors under 2 different sets of conditions, and you know, because you were there, that the difference was not a difference in the quality of the people involved. That knowledge, once it is somatic rather than theoretical, changes how you interpret everything for the rest of your life. Someone does not text back and you no longer run it through a self-assessment. Someone pulls away and you register it as information about their state rather than as a verdict on yours. A relationship ends and you can hold that it ended without concluding that you were found insufficient. That is a substantial upgrade, and it was expensive, and it is permanent. There is a second thing. You now know the difference between someone being unable and someone being unwilling, and more importantly, you know that from the receiving end they are identical. Which means you will stop making the distinction, because the distinction only ever mattered as a route to hope. Whether a person cannot give you what you need or will not give you what you need, you do not have it, and the not having it is the only fact that touches your life. That single realization will save you years in every future situation, because the question of why becomes irrelevant. What was going on for them is not something you have to solve before you are allowed to respond to what is actually happening. The timeline of how this actually resolves. It helps to know the shape in advance, because the shape is consistent, and knowing it prevents you from misreading the difficult stretches as evidence that you are not recovering. The first 2 weeks after the news are not really grief, they are shock, which is a different physiological state with different features. Shock produces a strange functional numbness alternating with waves of something sharper. You may find yourself unable to eat properly or sleeping badly or performing normally at work in a way that surprises you. None of this is a measure of how much you cared. Weeks 3 through 8 are the worst, and they are where the compulsive behavior lives. This is the checking period, the constructing period, the period of 3 in the morning questions. Almost everyone breaks their own rules at some point during this stretch and looks at something they promised themselves they would not look at. If you do not treat it as a collapse. Notice that it made things worse rather than better, and return to the plan. The plan does not require perfection to work. Somewhere around the 3rd month, something shifts, and it is subtle. The thoughts do not stop, but they lose some of their charge. You will think about them, and the thought will not produce a full-body response. This is the first real evidence, and it is easy to miss because it registers as nothing rather than as improvement. Months 4 through 8 are a long, flat stretch that most people find unexpectedly hard. The acute pain is gone and has been replaced by something duller and more persistent. This is where the temptation to break contact arises most convincingly, because the reasons not to have become abstract. Get through it by making it boring. Do not treat each day as a triumph of will, because framing it as an achievement keeps it in the foreground, and things in the foreground stay alive. Somewhere in the second half of the first year, if the information flow has actually been cut, the reorganization happens. Not a moment, a gradual change in what your mind spends its time on. You will notice retrospectively that a week went by in which they did not come up, then a month, and past that it becomes history. Not erased, not resolved, not converted into a lesson you feel grateful for, which is a thing people say and mostly do not mean. Just a period of your life that happened and is over and does not require ongoing management. That is the whole timeline, and it is measured in months rather than years if the information flow is genuinely cut, and in years if it is not, and that is the single largest variable under your control. Why the comparison feels so physical. There is something happening in your body during this, and understanding it helps, because you may be experiencing it as an emotional weakness when it is closer to a physiological event. Attachment is regulated by the same systems that regulate physical safety. That is not a metaphor about how love feels important. It is a description of the machinery. The brain treats the loss of an attachment figure as a threat to survival, because for most of human history it was one, and it produces a stress response accordingly. What you are experiencing includes elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep architecture, reduced appetite, and a specific kind of intrusive cognition that is characteristic of stress states. The obsessive thinking is not a personality flaw or a sign that you are unusually attached. It is what a brain does when it registers a threat it cannot resolve through action. The reason the news of their commitment produces such a severe version is that it removes the last remaining possibility of resolution. As long as the outcome was open, some part of your system was maintaining a plan. Now there is no plan available, and a threat with no available action produces the worst version of the response. There are 2 implications. The first is that you should stop interpreting the intensity as information about how much you love them or how badly you are handling this. It is information about a biological system doing what it does. It says nothing about your character. The second is that physical interventions work better than cognitive ones during this period, which is counterintuitive for a person who processes things by understanding them. Sleep is the highest return intervention available, and almost nobody prioritizes it. Sustained physical exertion works. Long walks work better than almost anything because the combination of rhythm and duration produces a downshift that thinking cannot achieve. Being around other people works even when you do not want to be around anyone. Understanding this situation perfectly will not resolve the physiological state, and you have probably been trying to understand your way out. It is the wrong tool. Understand it once, then work on the body, the version of this that happens to everyone. It may help to know how common this is, not because company reduces the pain, but because the sense of being singularly unlucky adds a layer that is unnecessary. The sequence you are living through is one of the most frequently reported patterns in relationship psychology. Long, difficult relationship with an ambivalent partner, ending after years of the other person doing most of the work, followed within a short period by that partner entering a rapid and apparently stable commitment with someone else. It happens constantly. It happens to people who did nothing wrong, and to people who did everything right, and to people across every demographic. There's a reason it is so common, and the reason is structural rather than coincidental. The relationship that ends this way ends because it reached a level of intimacy that the avoidant partner could not sustain. The intensity of the connection is what generated the pressure that caused the failure. And the moment it ends, the person is released into a state of low relational demand, which is the state in which they function best, and the next relationship begins from that state and does not immediately encounter the same pressure. So the sequence is not bad luck, it is the natural output of the mechanism. The relationship that goes deep is followed by one that does not have to, and the second one is more stable specifically because it is less deep, and the person on the outside sees stability and reads it as success. Almost everyone who has been through this reports the same thing at the 2-year mark, which is that the intensity of the pain in the first months was entirely disproportionate to the significance the event eventually held. That is not a promise that you will feel nothing. It is an observation that the current waiting is a feature of the acute phase and does not persist. Their regret and why you should not wait for it. There is frequently a later chapter, and it deserves accurate treatment because the inaccurate version of it will keep you waiting. Many avoidant people do eventually experience something about this relationship. It arrives late, often years, and it is not usually a dramatic realization. It is a persistent low-grade knowledge that surfaces occasionally, a sense that something happened once that has not happened since. It is not accompanied by a plan, and it does not produce contact in most cases, and when it does produce contact, the contact is exploratory rather than substantial. What it never becomes is the thing you are picturing, the full accounting. The specific acknowledgement of what you experienced, the description of your side of it delivered back to you correctly, that does not come, and the reason is mechanical rather than moral. Delivering that account would require sustained empathic reconstruction of another person's inner experience, which is precisely the capacity that avoidance suppresses. They cannot produce it. Not because they do not care, but because the machinery for it is the machinery that has been offline their whole life. So if some part of your recovery is waiting for that, you are waiting for a specific output from a system that does not manufacture it. There is a version of this that is worth accepting now rather than in 3 years. You are not going to be told. Not accurately, not fully, not in a form that satisfies. And your recovery cannot be contingent on being told, because contingent recovery is not recovery. It is a holding pattern with better branding. The account exists. You have it. You were present for the entire thing, and your record is complete and detailed and accurate, and it does not require a second signature to be valid. That is the actual release, and it is available immediately. Not the release from caring, which takes time. The release from needing it to be confirmed, what you are going to believe about yourself and should not. There are 4 specific conclusions that form in the weeks after this, and all 4 are wrong, and they will govern your next several years unless they are examined. The first is that you are unlovable in some specific way that you cannot see. This is the most common and the most corrosive. It has a particular quality, which is that it feels like a discovery rather than a thought, like you have finally understood something about yourself that everyone else could see. That sensation of revelation is characteristic of depressive cognition, and it is not a marker of accuracy. Genuine self-knowledge does not usually arrive as a devastating unified explanation for everything. The second is that you are too intense. This one is dangerous because it is adjacent to something true. You are intense in the sense that you go deep, notice a lot, and form strong attachments. That is a description of a temperament, not a defect. What has happened is that a temperament trait has been reclassified as a fault because it produced friction with one person whose system could not accommodate it. The same trait with someone who can is the thing they will find most valuable about you. The third is that you should have known sooner. Everyone concludes this, and it is uniformly false because the person concluding it has information now that was not available then. The pattern is only obvious in retrospect because you have the ending, and the ending is what makes the sequence legible. Without the ending, the individual events were genuinely ambiguous, and interpreting them charitably was not naivety, it was the reasonable response to ambiguous data from someone you had reason to trust. The fourth is that your judgment cannot be trusted. This is the one with the longest reach because it affects every future decision. What actually happened is that your judgment was operating inside a system specifically structured to make judgment difficult, and outside that system your judgment is fine, and you can verify this by noticing how accurate you are about everyone else's situations. Your read on other people's relationships is probably excellent. It was never a judgment problem. It was a proximity problem. Notice which of these four you have adopted. Most people adopt at least two. And notice that all four locate the cause inside you, which is what minds do when an outcome is painful and the actual cause is not available for inspection. What actually distinguished you? Since the comparison is running anyway, it is worth running it accurately in the other direction, not as consolation but as correction. You were the one who stayed present during difficulty. That is a rare capacity, and it is not distributed evenly. Most people withdraw when a relationship becomes hard. You did the opposite, which was costly and which is also the exact quality that makes someone worth building a life with. You were the one who could see them, not the presented version, the actual one. You had access to a person that almost nobody else has had access to, and the access was not granted, it was earned through attention over time. That capacity does not diminish because it was spent on someone who could not tolerate being seen. You were the one who kept trying to make it real. Whatever else happened, the relationship had a person in it who was oriented toward truth, who wanted the thing to be actual rather than comfortable, who kept pushing toward contact even when contact was punished. That orientation is the thing that makes deep relationships possible, and its absence is what makes them shallow. And you were the one who left. This is the one people forget to count. Eventually, after everything, you were the one who acted on what you knew. That is not a small thing, and it is the specific capacity that most people in your position never develop. You have proven you can do the hard exit, which means every future situation that requires it will be shorter. None of this makes you better than the person they are with. That framing is a trap, and it does not need to be entered. It simply establishes that the conclusion you have drawn from the outcome, which is that you lacked something, is not supported by the evidence of who you actually were in that relationship. The practical question of what comes next. At some point, the question of the next relationship arrives, and it arrives with a specific anxiety attached, which is that you will do this again. You will not do it the same way. The reason is not that you will be more disciplined. It is that you now have a somatic detection system that did not exist before. Certain things will produce a physical response in you now that they did not produce before. Inconsistency in the first month, warmth that increases when you pull back, a conversation that produces agreement and changes nothing. Vagueness about the future delivered warmly. You will feel these in your body before your analysis catches up, and the feeling will be unmistakable because you have felt it for years. That system is your protection. It cost a great deal to install, and it will save you an enormous amount. There is one caution. In the first stretch it will overfire. Ordinary human inconsistency will trigger it. Everyone is occasionally slow to respond, occasionally distracted, occasionally not at their best. The pattern is not any single instance. It is the shape across time, and specifically the inverse relationship between your investment and their availability. Give people about 6 weeks, watch the shape rather than the instance, and use the small number of markers that actually discriminate. Do they ask follow-up questions? Do they bring things back that you told them weeks ago? Can they receive a small piece of dissatisfaction without collapsing or attacking? Do they initiate in a pattern that does not correlate with your having recently pulled back? Are they the same person across contexts? Those 5 observed over 6 weeks will tell you almost everything, and none of them requires a conversation about the relationship. That is the entire change, not lower requirements, faster verification, what easily means. There is a version of this question that people ask hoping for a technique, and it deserves a straight answer. The question underneath everything is whether there was something you could have done, some approach, some adjustment, some way of being that would have produced the commitment. And the honest answer is that there was, in a technical sense, and you would not have wanted it. You could have required less, substantially less. If you had never asked about the future, never expressed disappointment, never needed consistency, never gone deep enough to trigger anything, the relationship could likely have continued indefinitely in some form. That is the technique. It works. It is available to anyone. The cost is that you would have had to not be a person in it. You would have had to convert yourself into a lower demand configuration and maintain the conversion for as long as the relationship lasted, which is to say forever, because the threshold does not move. That is what the promise of easily making someone commit always means in practice, not a method for changing them, a method for shrinking yourself to a size their system can tolerate. And it does produce commitment sometimes, and the commitment is to the shrunken version, and the shrunken version has to stay shrunken. You did not fail to find the technique. You declined to pay for it, mostly without knowing you were declining, by continuing to be a full person in a situation that required a partial one. That is the actual answer to why not you, not that you lacked something. That you brought something, and the something was more than the system could hold, and the alternative was to bring less. The life that is actually available. Here is the thing that is hardest to believe at the moment, and that is nonetheless true. What you wanted from that relationship is ordinary, not rare, not exotic, not something that only exists in fiction. You wanted consistency. You wanted to be thought about, you wanted difficult things to be discussable, you wanted someone to be reliably there. Enormous numbers of people have exactly that, in unremarkable relationships without any special circumstances. It is not a high bar. It only felt like one because you were asking it of someone structurally unable to provide it, and asking repeatedly and receiving nothing, and eventually concluding that the thing itself must be scarce. It is not scarce. It was scarce in the population of one you were sampling. And the reason this matters right now, while you are watching someone else receive what looks like the thing you wanted, is that you are drawing a conclusion about scarcity from an event that contains no information about scarcity. You are not watching the last available unit of commitment being allocated to someone else. You are watching one specific person do one specific thing under one specific set of conditions. There is no shortage, there was never a shortage. There was a locked door and you stood in front of it for years, and the door has now opened for someone under different conditions, and none of that changes the fact that there are other doors and most of them are not locked. That is not a platitude. It is a correction to a specific inference that you are currently making without noticing that you are making it. The days that will be hardest. There are specific days rather than a general difficulty, and they are predictable enough to prepare for. The day you see a photograph you were not expecting. This is the sharpest one, and it arrives without warning, usually through a mutual connection or an algorithm. The pain of it is out of proportion to the information contained, because the image bypasses your reasoning and delivers directly to a system that does not process arguments. Nothing about your understanding of the situation protects you from an image, and it is worth knowing this so that you do not interpret the reaction as a sign that you have made no progress. The day something good happens to you, this one surprises people, you would expect the pull to come during difficulty. It comes more strongly with good news because the reflex to tell them outlives the relationship by a long margin, and now the reflex arrives and finds not only that they are unavailable but that someone else is receiving that role. The day of a date that mattered, not necessarily an anniversary, often something incidental, a date that had significance for a reason nobody else would understand. The intensity on those days is a trick of the calendar rather than a signal about anything real. The day you are simply depleted. No trigger, no news, no anniversary, just tired, and the tiredness lowers the barrier and the old habits walk in through the gap. This is the most dangerous because it has no story attached, so there is nothing obvious to counter. The preparation is mechanical rather than emotional. Decide now while you are clear what you will do, not what you will feel, which you do not control, where the phone goes, who you contact instead, what the specific replacement action is. Decisions made in advance by a clear version of you are the only thing that reliably survives contact with a depleted version at 11 at night. Why this ending was better than the alternative. There is an alternative version of this that did not happen, and it is worth looking at because it makes the actual outcome legible as something other than pure loss. In the alternative version, you stayed. They did not leave, you did not leave, and the relationship continued in its established configuration. Another year, then 3, then 7. That version exists and people live in it. It has a recognizable shape. The requirements gradually withdraw, not because they are met, but because they stop being expressed. The person doing the work becomes quieter over time, not more peaceful, just quieter. The relationship stabilizes at a level of contact that is permanently insufficient and permanently tolerable, which is the worst combination, because insufficient and intolerable produces an ending and insufficient and tolerable produces a decade. And in that version, there is frequently a structure, a home, shared finances, possibly children. Which means the eventual reckoning, when it comes, arrives with an enormous amount of infrastructure attached, and the exit that would have taken a difficult month at year 3 takes a devastating 2 years at year 11. You are not in that version. Whatever happened and however much it hurt, you are on the outside of a configuration that a great many people spend their entire lives inside. That is not a reason to feel grateful, and anyone who tells you to feel grateful about this is asking for something unreasonable. It is simply a comparison that makes the current pain locatable in a larger picture where it is a cost rather than a catastrophe. the thing that will surprise you most. Somewhere in the middle of the recovery, something happens that almost nobody predicts, and that is worth anticipating so it can be recognized. You will feel relief about a specific thing, and the relief will be about not having to do the work anymore. It will arrive unexpectedly, usually during an ordinary moment, and it will feel almost disloyal. A realization that you are not currently managing anyone's mood, that you have not checked a phone with dread in some number of weeks. That you can say what you think without running it through a filter first, that there is no ongoing situation requiring interpretation. The relief is significant and it is confusing because it coexists with grief and people expect emotions to be exclusive. They are not. You can miss someone enormously and be relieved they are gone simultaneously, and both are accurate readings of different aspects of the same situation. What the relief tells you is how much labor was involved. You will not have known. The labor was continuous and therefore invisible, in the way that a background noise becomes inaudible until it stops. And when it stops, the quiet is startling, and the startle is your first accurate measurement of what you were carrying. Take that measurement seriously. It is the most reliable evidence you will get about whether the relationship was actually good, because it is generated by your body rather than by your narrative, and bodies do not construct favorable accounts. What their commitment does not prove. To close the central argument, it is worth stating in the most compressed form. Their commitment does not prove they were capable of what you wanted and withheld it from you. It proves they were capable of a specific structure under specific conditions. It does not prove the new person is better. It proves the new configuration triggers less. It does not prove your requirements were excessive. It proves their threshold was low. It does not prove you failed to find the key. It proves the lock changed, and it changed for reasons that were not available to you and were not about you. It does not prove that the years were wasted. It proves nothing at all about the years, which happened and contained real things, and produced a person who now knows something that took an expensive education to learn. And it does not prove that this is scarce. It proves nothing about availability. One person's behavior in one situation is not data about the world. Every painful inference you are currently making requires a premise that does not hold, which is that commitment measures feeling. It does not measure feeling. It measures the interaction between a person's capacity and the demands of a situation, and you were in a situation with high demand and low capacity, and that is the whole of it. Standing in the actual present. Come back from the analysis for a moment, because the analysis can become its own way of staying in the relationship. Right now, wherever you are, none of this is happening. The relationship is not occurring. The other person is not present. The comparison is not taking place anywhere except inside your own head, where you have constructed a courtroom and installed yourself as both defendant and prosecutor. There is no case. Nobody is bringing one. The event happened and is over and has no continuing action attached, and the entire experience of it as an ongoing crisis is being generated internally. That is not a criticism. It is a description of where the work is. The work is not out there. It is not in getting an answer or seeing the collapse or being told the truth. It is in the gradual reduction of how much of your interior is allocated to a situation that has already concluded. And that reduction is not achieved by force. It happens through the accumulation of other things. Other people, other work, other days that contain material of their own. The old content does not get deleted. It gets diluted by volume over time until it occupies a proportion of your life that matches its actual importance rather than the proportion it currently claims. You are not going to think your way to the end of this. You are going to live your way to it slowly, in a series of days that will feel unremarkable while you are having them, and that will turn out to have been the entire mechanism. The part of you that wants them to fail. It should be said plainly that you probably want the new relationship to fail, at least sometimes, and that this does not make you a bad person, and that it is also worth handling rather than indulging. The wish is not really about them. It is a request for the universe to confirm your account of what happened. If the pattern reappears with someone else, then the pattern was real and it was theirs and you were not the cause. The wish for their failure is a wish for evidence. You do not need the evidence. You already have it in the form of 4 years of first-hand observation, and no external confirmation would add anything to a case that is already closed in your own understanding. The wish persists not because the case is open, but because you are not yet willing to be the sole authority on your own experience. There is also a practical problem with the wish, which is that it makes your peace conditional on an outcome you cannot observe and do not control. If your recovery requires their relationship to fail, then you have to keep watching to find out, and the watching is what is hurting you, and you have built a recovery that requires the injury to continue. Let the wish exist without feeding it. It will show up. It does not need to be suppressed or apologized for or converted into something more admirable. It just should not be given a job. What it will do if left alone is fade, not into generosity necessarily, into indifference, which is better and more durable and which is the actual destination, when you meet someone who can do it easily. There is a specific future moment worth describing because it will land strangely. At some point you will be with someone early on, and they will do something that requires no effort from them, and that would have been impossible in your previous relationship. They will say what they want, they will make a plan and keep it. They will refer to something in the future without any of the hedging that used to accompany every statement about the future. They will do this casually without appearing to notice that anything significant has occurred, and you will feel something complicated, and part of it will be anger, because you will realize in that moment how easy it is when the system is not fighting itself. You spent years extracting, through enormous labor, a fraction of what this person produces without trying. And the ease of it will retroactively illuminate exactly how much was being withheld, or rather how much was not available, and the illumination will hurt. That anger is appropriate, and it is a late-stage phenomenon, and it means the recovery is working. Anger requires a belief that you were owed something. It shows up only after the self-blame has receded enough to make room for it. Let it be as large as it is. Do not manage it for anyone's comfort. It is finite and it burns through, and what is on the other side of it is the ability to simply enjoy the ease without needing to compare it to anything. What you will say about this in 5 years. The account you will give of this eventually is much shorter than the one you would give now, and it is worth knowing that, because the current length is a feature of the acute phase. It will be something like, I was with someone for a few years who could not really be in it, and I stayed longer than I should have, and after it ended they got married quite quickly, and that was hard for a while. That is the whole thing at distance. Not because it was small, but because time compresses everything, and the enormous detail that currently occupies your mind will not survive the compression, because most of that detail is being generated by the attempt to solve something rather than by the event itself. The people who are 5 years past this describe it consistently as a hinge point rather than as a wound. They usually locate something specific that changed in them as a result, and the something is almost always the same. They stopped interpreting other people's limitations as verdicts on their own worth. That is what you are in the process of learning, expensively, and it is the only genuinely valuable thing to come out of this, and it will pay for itself repeatedly across the rest of your life in situations that have nothing to do with romance. The years you are calling wasted. There is an accounting happening in your head, and it is being done badly, and it deserves to be redone properly. You are treating those years as a loss with no return, as time handed over to someone who took it and gave it to somebody else. And in that framing, the amount you lost is the entire duration, and the loss is total, and there is nothing to set against it. That accounting is wrong in a specific way. It counts the cost accurately and does not count anything on the other side, which is not a rigorous method. Set against it, then, what was actually acquired. You learned what the pattern feels like from the inside in complete detail over a long enough period that the knowledge is permanent. That is not a small acquisition. Most people carry this pattern for decades and go through 3 or 4 versions before it becomes visible, because the individual instances are ambiguous and only the aggregate is legible. You have the aggregate, you will not need to collect it again. You learned that you can leave. That is a demonstrated capacity now, not a theoretical one. Whatever else happens in your life, when you are in a situation that requires ending, you have evidence about your own behavior under those conditions, and the evidence says that you eventually act on what you know even when acting costs everything. You learn the specific taste of the thing you actually want, which is different from the abstract idea of it. Before this, you would have said you wanted love, and the word would have been vague. Now you could give a precise specification: consistency, reciprocal attention, the ability to raise a difficult thing without triggering a retreat, being thought about when you are not present. That specification is worth an enormous amount because it converts a vague search into a defined one. And you learn something about your own capacity that you did not know. You now know that you can sustain enormous emotional load for years without collapsing. That is genuinely useful information about yourself, and it will show up in contexts that have nothing to do with relationships. None of this means the years were worth it. That is a different question, and it has no useful answer, because the transaction is complete and non-reversible, and the only remaining decision is what to do with what was purchased. But they were not empty. The accounting that says they were empty is not honest accounting. It is grief doing arithmetic. Why you cannot simply decide to stop caring. You have probably tried to reason yourself out of this and found that it does not work, and it is worth understanding why, because the failure is not a failure of will. Attachment is not maintained by belief. It is maintained by a system that developed long before the capacity for belief existed, and it does not consult your conclusions. You can hold with complete conviction that this person was not good for you, that the relationship was damaging, that you would not want them back, and the system will continue producing longing regardless because the system does not read your conclusions. This is why people find themselves in the strange position of missing someone they do not want. It is not contradiction. It is two different processes running simultaneously in different parts of the same person. The implication is practical. Stop trying to resolve the feeling by improving your understanding. The understanding is already sufficient. You could not explain this situation more clearly than you already can, and the clarity has not reduced the longing by any measurable amount, and it will not because they are not connected. What actually reduces it is time plus the absence of reinforcement. Every contact, every image, every piece of news reinforces the attachment circuitry and resets the extinction process. That is the whole mechanism, and it is why the practical advice about cutting the information flow is not moralism about self-respect. It is the only lever that operates on the actual system. The feeling will outlast the understanding by a long margin. That is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is the normal relationship between those two systems, and everyone who has been through this reports the same gap, and the gap closes on its own schedule. The difference between missing them and missing the hope. There is a distinction here that clarifies an enormous amount once it is made, and most people never make it. Some of what you are feeling is about a person. Their specific presence, their particular way of laughing, the texture of being in a room with them. That is real grief, and it behaves like ordinary grief, arriving in waves, attaching to sensory triggers, gradually diminishing. Most of what you are feeling is not that. Most of it is about the loss of an anticipated future. For years, you were living substantially in a projected version of your life in which this eventually worked. That projection was doing a great deal of load-bearing work. It gave the present difficulty a purpose. It meant the waiting was an investment. It meant that every hard month was a payment towards something. And the projection is now gone, and it took with it the meaning that was attached to all those months, and the retroactive removal of meaning from years of your life is a specific and severe kind of loss that most people never learn to name. You can distinguish them by noticing what your mind does when it hurts. If it produces a memory, a specific scene, a sensory detail, that is grief for the person. If it produces a scenario, something that did not happen, a future version, that is grief for the projection. The second kind is more common and it responds to different treatment. Grief for a person is processed by feeling it. Grief for a projection is processed by building an alternative projection, which sounds cold and is actually the mechanism. You need somewhere else for the future-oriented part of your mind to go, and it will not accept a vacancy, and if you do not give it a destination, it will keep returning to the old one. That is why practical forward motion helps so much more than it seems like it should. It is not distraction, it is supplying a replacement for the specific thing that was lost. What happened to your sense of time? There is a distortion operating right now that is worth naming because it is making everything worse and it is invisible. You are measuring your recovery in days, and at that resolution, progress is undetectable. Real change in this process happens at a rate of something like a few % per month, which means that on any given day, compared with the day before, nothing has happened. And the absence of visible progress reads as evidence that you are not recovering, which produces despair, which is itself painful and which does not correspond to anything real. Try measuring across longer intervals. Compare now with 6 weeks ago, not with yesterday. That comparison will almost always show something, and the something is the actual rate of change, and it is slow and it is happening. There is also a distortion in the other direction, which is that the acute phase feels permanent while you are in it. This is a well-documented feature of intense emotional states. The state generates a prediction that it will continue indefinitely, and the prediction feels like knowledge rather than like a symptom. Everyone in an acute grief state believes they will feel this way forever, and almost nobody does, and the belief is produced by the state rather than by any assessment of the evidence. You have probably already had this experience with something else in your life, some earlier loss that felt terminal and is now simply a thing that happened. Try to recall the texture of being inside that one. Try to recall that you also believed at the time that it would not lift. It lifted. The mechanism is not different this time. The conversation with yourself that needs to change. There's a voice running commentary through all of this, and it has a particular tone, and the tone is worth examining because you would not accept it from anyone else. It says things like, "You knew and you stayed anyway." It says, "You wasted the best years of your life on someone who did not want you." It says, "Everyone could see it." It says, "You are going to do this again." Notice that this voice does not sound like an enemy. It sounds like honesty. That is its most effective feature. It presents as the part of you that is finally being realistic, and any attempt to answer it feels like self-deception. It is not honesty. Honesty includes the whole record, and this voice is running a selected version. It omits the reasons the situation was ambiguous. It omits the reinforcement schedule. It omits the fact that you did eventually leave. It omits everything that would complicate the verdict, and a case that omits exculpatory material is not an honest case, it is a prosecution. The correction is not to argue with it, which does not work because it will simply produce more material. The correction is to notice the format. Ask whether the sentence you are hearing would be said to a friend in the same situation by anyone you would want in your life. If not, the sentence is not information. It is a habit of address learned somewhere, probably early, and it is running automatically because the current situation is exactly the kind that activates it. You do not have to defeat it. You have to stop treating it as a source, something about the other person. It is worth saying one thing about the person they committed to, mostly so that the subject can be closed properly. They are not your opponent. They did not take something from you. In almost every case, they entered a situation that was already over and had no involvement in how it ended, and possess a version of events that does not include you as anything more than a name. Whatever they are receiving from a person who has limits, and the limits have not gone anywhere. They will encounter them on their own schedule in their own way, and it will be their situation to handle. There is a temptation to construct them as either a villain or as the superior version of you, and neither is accurate, and both are ways of keeping the comparison alive. The accurate version is much less interesting. They are a person doing their life in a relationship that has its own texture that you know nothing about. Letting them be uninteresting is one of the most useful things you can do, not because they deserve your generosity, but because a person you find uninteresting cannot occupy space in your mind, and space in your mind is the resource being consumed. The recovery nobody describes. Most accounts of getting over something like this describe an emotional arc and skip the part that actually occupies the majority of the time, which is administrative. The real recovery is largely a series of small logistical acts, removing an account from a follow list, telling a friend in one uncomfortable sentence not to mention this person anymore. Deciding what you will do with the photographs, which does not have to be a dramatic deletion and can simply be moving them somewhere you will not encounter them. Changing a route that goes past somewhere, declining an invitation to an event where they will be once without explanation. None of these feels significant, each takes minutes. Together they constitute most of what actually determines how long this takes, because together they control the rate of reinforcement, and the rate of reinforcement is the variable that governs the entire process. People spend enormous energy on the emotional work and neglect the administrative work, and then wonder why the emotional work is not producing results. The emotional work cannot produce results while the reinforcement continues. You cannot process a loss that keeps arriving, so if you do nothing else, do the logistics. They are boring and they require no courage, and they are worth more than any amount of insight. A note on how long this should take. People want a number, and there is a rough one, and it is worth giving with the caveats attached. For a relationship of several years ending this way, with the information flow genuinely cut, the acute phase runs about 3 months, and the substantial reorganization completes somewhere between 9 and 18 months. That is not a promise, and individual variation is enormous, but it is the general shape. With the information flow not cut, there is no reliable timeline, because the process cannot complete. People remain in a low-grade version of this for many years when the monitoring continues, and the monitoring feels harmless because each individual instance is brief, and the cumulative effect is that nothing finishes. There is one more variable that matters more than anything except contact, which is whether you are actively building something else. Not as distraction, as replacement. The mind allocates attention to whatever is most alive, and if the most alive thing in your life is a concluded relationship, that is where the attention goes, regardless of your intentions. The single most effective intervention available to you is to make something in your present life more compelling than the past one. That is difficult right now because everything feels flat, and the flatness is a symptom, and you have to act before the symptom lifts rather than waiting for it to lift first. That is the hard instruction in all of this. Do the thing before you want to. The wanting comes back afterward in that order and never in the reverse. Why there's certainty now is not evidence about then. There is a detail that tortures people specifically, and it is not the commitment itself but the apparent certainty of it, the decisiveness, the absence of the endless hedging that characterized everything with you. That contrast seems to prove something conclusive. With you, constant ambivalence, with them, apparently none. Surely that is the clearest possible evidence about relative feeling. It is evidence about something, and it is not that. Ambivalence in an avoidant person is not indecision about the other person. It is the observable output of two systems in conflict. One system wants the connection, the other reads the connection as danger. The ambivalence is the war between them, and the intensity of the war is proportional to how much both systems are activated, which means it is proportional to how much they wanted it and how threatening it was. A situation in which only one system is activated produces no ambivalence at all. It produces smoothness, clarity, apparent certainty. Which means the absence of ambivalence is not evidence of stronger feeling. In this population, it is frequently evidence of a lower level of activation on both sides of the conflict, and the smoothness that looks like conviction is closer to the absence of stakes. You saw the war because you were the thing worth fighting about. That is a hard sentence to hold when what you can see is someone else receiving the peace, and it is the accurate one. None of this is a reason to hope. It changes nothing about the outcome. It only changes what the outcome means, and what it means is currently the entire problem, because you have assigned it a meaning that is untrue and unbearable, and the accurate meaning is merely sad. The loneliness of knowing this. There is a specific isolation in this experience, and it should be named because it makes everything harder, and it is rarely acknowledged. Almost nobody around you will understand it properly. The friends who care about you will offer the standard consolations, and the standard consolations are all built on a model that does not fit. They will say you deserve better, which assumes it was about deserving. They will say they will regret it, which reintroduces waiting. They will say you are better off, which is true and is not helpful in the acute phase. They will say time heals, which is accurate and useless. None of them will address the actual structure of what happened, because the actual structure is unusual and specific, and requires knowing things about attachment that most people have no reason to know. So you will find yourself in the strange position of being the only person in your life who understands your own situation, which means you cannot be helped in the ordinary way, which means you will be somewhat alone in it even while being surrounded by people who care. That is real and it is temporary, and there are two things that help. The first is finding one person who does get it, and there usually is one, often someone who has been through a version of it themselves. They do not need to give advice. They need to say the thing that indicates comprehension, and comprehension from one person is worth more than sympathy from 20. The second is accepting the ordinary consolations for what they are, which is not analysis but presence. When someone says you deserve better, they are not making an argument. They are saying I am on your side and I am here. Received as an argument, it is unsatisfying. Received as presence, it is exactly what it is meant to be. Do not correct people. They are not trying to solve it. They are trying to be with you while it happens, and letting them do that imperfectly is better than being accurately alone. What it means that you are still here. Something has been true throughout all of this, and it has gone unremarked, and it is worth stopping on. You have continued to function. Through the whole of that relationship, through the ending, through this, you have gone to work. You have maintained relationships. You have handled the ordinary logistics of a life while carrying an enormous internal load that nobody could see. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, the thing that most deserves attention in this entire situation, and it has received none because you do not count it as anything. Consider what it took. Years of managing a relationship that required continuous emotional labor, while also being a person with a job and family and obligations. An ending, then this, which is worse than the ending. And through all of it, the ordinary machinery of your life has kept running, largely without visible failure, maintained by you alone, without recognition. The capacity that made that possible is the same capacity you have been calling weakness. The endurance, the tolerance for difficulty, the ability to keep functioning while in pain. You have been treating those as the reasons you stayed too long, which they partly are, and neglecting that they are also the reasons you are still standing. The task is not to remove that capacity. It is to stop deploying it in service of situations that do not deserve it. The endurance is not the problem. The allocation was, and you are here, reading something about a difficult thing, trying to understand it, doing the work of processing rather than avoiding. That is what recovery actually looks like from inside, and from inside it does not feel like anything, and it is nonetheless what is happening. The small correction that prevents a repeat. If there is one adjustment to carry forward, it is not a rule about avoidant people. It is smaller and more general, and it applies everywhere. Stop explaining the second time. That is the entire intervention. Say the real thing once plainly, early, then stop and observe. Do not refine it, do not find better wording, do not try again at a more receptive moment, do not build a case, because the second explanation is where the whole disease starts. The second explanation contains the assumption that the failure to respond was a problem with your delivery, and once you accept that assumption, you can spend years inside it, refining an argument to someone who understood you perfectly the first time and simply cannot do what you asked. Everything that happened to you lives in the gap between the first attempt and the 100th. And the place to intervene is not at the 100th, where it is obvious and too late. It is at the second, where it is barely noticeable and where the entire trajectory is still available to be changed. Practice it in small places, at work when a request goes unanswered, with a friend who keeps doing the same thing, anywhere you notice the impulse to say it again with better framing. What you will find is that in relationships that work once is enough, the repetition was never necessary, and the situations where once is not enough are the situations that would have cost you years, and you will now identify them in a fortnight. That is the whole lesson, and it fits in a sentence, and it is worth more than everything else in this. The story you will tell yourself about your own worth. There is a decision being made right now, quietly, and it will govern more of your life than the relationship did. The decision is what this event means about you. And it is being made under the worst possible conditions, by a version of you that is exhausted and in pain and operating on incomplete information, and whatever it concludes will feel like a permanent discovery rather than a temporary interpretation. That is why it is worth being deliberate about it now, before the conclusion sets. There are 2 available readings and both fit the facts. In the first, you were found insufficient by someone who then found sufficiency elsewhere, and the insufficiency is a property of you that you carry forward. In the second, you were in a relationship with a person whose capacity was limited under the conditions you shared, and the limitation was theirs, and the conditions changed, and none of it measured you. Both readings explain everything that happened. Neither can be proven. The evidence is equally compatible with both, which means the choice between them is not an empirical question. It is a decision about which story to live inside. That may sound like a suggestion to comfort yourself with a convenient belief. It is not. It is a description of the actual epistemic situation, which is that you do not have access to the truth of this and will never have access to it, and that in the absence of access you are choosing, and the choice has consequences. Choose the second one, not because it is nicer. Because it has more support from everything else you know about attachment, because the first one requires a mechanism nobody can identify, and because the second one produces a person who can be loved and the first one produces a person who is permanently auditioning. You will not believe it immediately. Beliefs installed by pain do not yield to argument. But you can decide which one you are going to act as though is true, and acting is what eventually produces belief, and not the other way around, where the original wound came from. If you look carefully at what hurt most in this, it is probably not the loss of the relationship. It is the confirmation of something you already suspected about yourself, and the something predates them by a long time. Most people who are devastated by this specific sequence are devastated because it matches an older template. Somewhere early there was an experience of being not quite chosen, of watching attention go elsewhere, of being adequate but not the priority, of loving someone who was distracted or overwhelmed or oriented toward something other than you. That experience installs a belief, and the belief is not "I was unlucky." Children do not conclude that adults are limited. They conclude that they themselves are insufficient, because that conclusion preserves the possibility of fixing it, and preserving that possibility is more important to a child than accuracy. And then that belief sits there dormant for decades, and it looks for confirmation, and one day something happens that fits the template perfectly, and the belief activates at full strength, and the current pain is the old pain plus the new one, arriving together, indistinguishable. That is why the intensity of your response may seem disproportionate even to you. It is not disproportionate to this event. It is proportionate to this event plus everything it is standing in for. Recognizing this does not dissolve it, but it does relocate the work. The thing that actually needs attention is not the relationship, which is over and understood. It is the older sentence, which is still running and which has just been fed by something that seemed to prove it. That is worth serious attention, and it is the kind of attention that is genuinely helped by working with someone trained for it, because templates installed that early do not usually yield to individual effort, and there is no reason to do the hardest thing available to a person entirely alone. The freedom you have not noticed yet. There is something available to you now that was not available for the entire duration of that relationship, and you have probably not registered it because it does not announce itself. You are no longer waiting for a decision that is not yours to make. For years, the central fact of your life was pending, whether this would become something. Whether they would arrive, whether the thing you had built would be recognized. That question sat above everything and colored every plan and made every decision provisional, because you could not fully commit to any direction while the largest variable in your life was being determined by someone else. That question is answered, badly, painfully, not the way you wanted, and answered. Which means that for the first time in a long time, nothing about your future is contingent on another person's internal state. You can plan, you can decide where to live without calculating, you can take an opportunity that would have been impossible. You can direct your life without running every choice through a filter of how it affects the possibility of something that was never going to happen. That freedom is currently unpleasant, because freedom that arrives through loss always is, and because you did not choose it. But it is real and it is substantial, and it is the largest practical change in your circumstances. Most people in the year after this do something they had been postponing, move somewhere, change work, start something, not as a reaction and not as a performance for anyone, but because a large obstruction has been removed and things become possible that were not possible before. Watch for what becomes possible. It will not feel like an opportunity at first. It will just be a thing you notice you could do now, when you are ready, and how you will know. There is a question about when to be open to something new, and the standard answers are unhelpful, so here is a more precise one. You are not ready when you have stopped thinking about them. That standard is too high and almost nobody meets it, and waiting for it produces years of unnecessary solitude. You are ready when a new person is not being evaluated against them. That is the actual test. When you meet someone and your mind is not running a continuous comparison, when their qualities are being assessed on their own terms rather than as evidence for or against a case about the past, then the machinery has cleared enough for something to be built. There is a second test that is more practical. Can you tolerate the flatness? Because a healthy connection with a stable person will initially feel less intense than what you had, and if you are still calibrated to read activation as significance, the flatness will register as absence and you will discard someone worth having. If you can notice the flatness, name it as a calibration issue rather than a compatibility signal, and stay for another 2 months, you are ready. If the flatness still reads as proof that there is nothing there, wait longer. And a third, which matters more than either, can you say a direct thing early and let the response be whatever it is? If you find yourself pre-screening, softening, waiting for the right moment, that is the old machinery still running, and it will reproduce the old dynamic with whoever is in front of you. None of these require you to be finished grieving. You can miss someone and be ready for something else at the same time. Those are not in conflict, and the belief that they are keeps people alone considerably longer than necessary. The version of events circulating elsewhere. You may encounter at some point an account of your relationship from their side, and it will be disorienting, and it is worth preparing for. The version circulating will almost certainly not contain the material you consider essential. It will not include the years of accumulation. It will not include the labor. It will very likely characterize the difficulty as mutual, or as a matter of timing, or as the sort of thing that just does not work out, and it will be delivered without apparent distress. Frequently, it will include something about you that stings, usually a version of you being difficult or needing too much. That characterization is the most painful possible thing to hear, and it is also, from their perceptual position, an honest report. They experience your requirements as pressure because their system converts requirements into pressure. They are not lying. They are describing an experience that was real for them, and that was produced by their own machinery rather than by your behavior. You cannot correct it. Attempting to correct it converts you into a person litigating a breakup, which makes their account more credible rather than less, and which costs you energy you need elsewhere. What helps is remembering that accounts of relationships are not documentary evidence. They are reports from inside a perceptual system, and two people in the same relationship produce reports so different that they can be hard to recognize as descriptions of the same events. Yours is not more valid because it hurts more. It is more complete because you were tracking more, and completeness is not the same as authority, and neither of you is going to be adjudicated. Let the account exist. Your reputation among people who are not in the relationship is not a resource you need. What to do with the things you kept. There are objects and they present a problem that is more practical than emotional, and that people make unnecessarily dramatic. The standard advice is to remove everything, and the standard advice is roughly correct and is usually delivered with an intensity that makes people resist it. The useful version is quieter. You do not need to destroy anything. You do not need to hold a ceremony. What you need is for the objects to stop appearing unexpectedly, because the unexpected appearance is what does the damage, not the existence of the object. So put them somewhere. A box, a folder, a hard drive, out of the daily path. Not deleted, because deletion frequently produces its own kind of distress, and because you may want them in 10 years when they are simply artifacts of a period in your life. Just relocated so that they are encountered by choice rather than by accident. The same principle applies to digital material. Archive rather than delete. Remove from the visible layer. The point is control over timing, not erasure. There is one exception worth naming, which is anything that functions as a reinforcement mechanism. If there is something you look at repeatedly, something you return to when you are low, that one should go further away than the others, because it is not an object, it is a behavior with an object attached. And there will be one item that is disproportionately difficult. Everyone has one. It is usually small and not obviously significant. Deal with that one last, and do not make it a test of your progress, because it is not. The way this changes what you look for. There is a shift that happens in what registers as attractive, and it happens slowly, and it is the most reliable sign that the recovery is structural rather than superficial. Right now, a certain quality of unavailability probably still reads as compelling. Someone slightly out of reach, slightly hard to read, slightly withholding, produces a particular alertness that you have learned to interpret as interest. That interpretation is not a preference. It is a conditioned response, and the conditioning came from an environment where love was uncertain, and where uncertainty was therefore fused with love in the same signal. What changes over time and with exposure to something different is that the alertness stops reading as attraction and starts reading as fatigue. That is the whole shift. The same stimulus producing the same physiological signal, interpreted differently, and therefore acted on differently. You will know it has happened when someone slightly unavailable produces in you not interest but a small internal sigh. When the thought of the work involved arrives before the excitement. When you find yourself declining, easily, without agonizing, because the calculation has already been run and returned a clear answer. That shift is not achievable through decision. It happens through repeated experience of the alternative, which means it requires you to spend time around consistent people and to tolerate the initial flatness for long enough that a different signal becomes detectable. That is why the advice about giving something a year is not about giving a particular person a chance. It is about giving your own calibration enough exposure to change. Two things that are both true. To close the substance of this, hold both of these simultaneously, because holding only one produces a distortion. The first is that this was not about your worth. Nothing that happened measured you. The mechanism was structural, the conditions were not yours to control, and the outcome would have been substantially the same regardless of who you had been, provided you were a person who required an ordinary amount. The second is that you participated. You stayed after you knew. You accepted terms that were not acceptable to you. You suppressed requirements rather than enforcing them, and the suppression extended the situation by years. Those are both true, and they do not cancel. The first one prevents you from carrying a false deficiency forward. The second one gives you something to actually change, which is the only useful output of any of this. If you hold only the first, you become someone to whom things happen, and that is a comfortable position with no exit. If you hold only the second, you become someone who blames themselves for a system they did not build, and that is the position you are currently occupying, and it is not accurate. The two together produce something workable. It was not about your worth, and there is something for you to do differently, and the something is not becoming a smaller person. It is enforcing requirements earlier, verifying faster, and leaving sooner. That is the whole adjustment, and it is available to you now, and it does not require anyone's cooperation. The ordinary morning that is coming. There is a specific future moment worth holding on to, and it is small, and it is the actual destination rather than any of the more dramatic things you might be imagining. It is a morning some distance from here. Nothing is happening in it. You are doing something routine, making something, going somewhere, and their name enters your mind in the ordinary way that names do, attached to nothing in particular. And it produces almost nothing, a small recognition, the way you might think of a former colleague or a place you used to live. Not indifference exactly, because indifference implies effort. Just the ordinary neutrality of a fact about your history. You will notice in that moment that you had not thought about them in some length of time you cannot specify. And the not thinking will not have been an achievement. It will not have required discipline. It will simply be what your mind was doing, which was something else. That is the end of this, not an apology. Not a collapse over there, not a message that finally explains everything, not the satisfaction of being told you were right, just a morning in which someone who occupied years of your interior life occupies almost none of it, and the reduction happened without your noticing, through nothing but the accumulation of days that contained other material. It is coming. Not soon and not on a schedule you control, and not through any technique, through time and the removal of reinforcement and the slow refilling of a space that has been vacant. And when you are in it, the thing you will find remarkable is not that you got over them. It is how much of your own life was there the whole time, running underneath, waiting, entirely available, obscured by an ongoing situation that had already ended, before you move on. One last thing, and it is directed at the part of you that is still, somewhere, keeping a small light on. You are allowed to have loved them. Fully, without qualification, without the retroactive editing that makes it easier to have lost. You do not have to convert them into a villain in order to be finished. You do not have to decide the whole thing was worthless in order to leave it behind. There is a version of recovery that requires demolishing the past, and it is faster in the short term and it costs something, because what gets demolished is not only the relationship but your own capacity to have loved well, and you did love well, and that is worth keeping. You can hold that it was real, that they were not a monster, that some of it was among the best experiences of your life, and that it is over and cannot be returned to and should not be. All of that fits together. Complexity is not indecision. What you are leaving is not the memory, it is the waiting. Those are different things, and only one of them is costing you anything. Keep the years. Let go of the pending question. The question has been answered badly by someone else's life, and the answer was never going to come in a form that satisfied you, and you do not need it in order to proceed. What you would tell someone else. There is a diagnostic worth running, and it takes about a minute, and it is more clarifying than any amount of analysis. Imagine a friend describing this exact situation to you, every detail identical. Years with someone who could not be consistent, who withdrew whenever things deepened, who kept the future permanently undefined, an ending, and then months later the news that this person has committed to somebody else. Consider what you would say to them, not the polite version, the actual thing you believe. You would not say that they were insufficient. That thought would not even arrive, because from outside the situation it is obviously not what happened. You would say that the person had a pattern, that the pattern was not about your friend, that the new relationship will be shaped by the same pattern eventually, and that your friend is now free of something that was consuming them. You would believe that completely, you would be able to defend it in detail, and you would be right. The gap between what you would say to them and what you are saying to yourself is not a gap in information. You have the same facts in both cases. It is a gap in who the standard applies to, and that gap is the actual thing worth examining, because it did not appear during this relationship. You brought it in with you. A person who applies a compassionate and accurate standard to everyone except themselves has learned that from somewhere, and the learning usually happened long before any of this, and it is the mechanism that made you tolerable to a person who needed someone who would absorb costs without invoicing them. That is the thing that actually needs to change, and it is bigger than this relationship, and this relationship is only the most recent place it showed up. Start by noticing the discrepancy. Every time a harsh sentence about yourself arrives, run it through the friend test. Would you say this to someone you cared about in this situation with these facts? If not, the sentence is not a finding. It is a habit, the thing you have not let yourself feel. There is probably an emotion you have been keeping out of this, and it is not sadness, and it is not shame, and it is the one that will move things most when it arrives. It is anger, and specifically it is anger at them, and you have likely been avoiding it because you have been so committed to understanding. The understanding is real and it is accurate, and it has one significant side effect, which is that a fully explained behavior becomes hard to be angry about. If it was their nervous system, if they could not help it, if the mechanism was operating below their awareness, then who exactly is there to be angry with? Here is the resolution. Explanation is not exemption. A person can be doing something they cannot easily control and still be responsible for its effects on you. The mechanism explains the behavior. It does not transfer the cost. You still paid, and there were choices inside the mechanism. There always are. The specific decision to keep the future undefined rather than saying honestly that they could not offer one. The decision to accept years of your effort without ever examining what it cost you. The decision at some point to know that you wanted something they could not give and to stay anyway, receiving the benefit rather than releasing you. Those are not autonomic responses. Those are choices made by an adult repeatedly, and the fact that they were made under the influence of a pattern does not remove them from the category of things a person did. You are allowed to be angry about that. It does not make your understanding false. It does not make you bitter. Anger at this stage is a structural component of recovery, because anger requires the belief that you were owed something, and the return of that belief is exactly what has been missing. Let it be as large as it is. It is finite. It will not become your personality. And on the other side of it is something that self-blame cannot produce, which is the plain sense that you were treated in a way that was not acceptable and that you would not accept again. Why this hurts more than the breakup did. It is worth acknowledging directly that this is worse than the ending was, because most people are confused by that and interpret it as evidence that they have regressed. The ending was a loss with an explanation attached. However painful it was, it made sense. The relationship failed because the person could not do relationships, and that account, while devastating, was coherent, and coherent pain is survivable. This is a loss of the explanation itself, which is a different category of event. When an explanatory framework collapses, everything it was holding up collapses with it, and that includes a great deal that seemed unrelated. Your account of the past becomes unstable. Your understanding of your own behavior in it becomes uncertain. The meaning you had assigned to years of difficulty evaporates and has to be reassigned, and the reassignment happens automatically, in an instant, by a mind that is in pain, and that will grab the first available replacement. The first available replacement is always the worst one. It was me. That is why the intensity is higher now than it was at the ending. You are not experiencing a second breakup. You are experiencing the demolition of the structure you built to survive the first one, and demolitions are more violent than the events that made the building necessary. The useful implication is that the work is different this time. At the ending, the work was grieving. Now the work is rebuilding an explanation, and the explanation you build in the next few weeks is going to determine a great deal. Build it carefully. Build it out of what you actually know about how this person operated across years of first-hand observation, not out of the 2 seconds of information that arrived with the news. You are the world's leading expert on this specific person's behavior. Do not defer to a photograph, the small daily practice. If everything else is too much to carry, there is one thing to do daily, and it takes almost no time. Each day, notice one instance in which you treated yourself the way you were treated in that relationship. That is the whole practice. Not a resolution to be kinder, which does not work, but an act of observation. Look for the moment when you dismissed your own need as excessive, when you talked yourself out of asking for something, when you decided your reaction was disproportionate before checking whether it was, when you absorbed a cost silently rather than mentioning it. Those moments happen constantly, and they are invisible because they are habitual, and they are the residue of the relationship operating inside you now that the relationship has ended. You do not have to fix them, just count them. Observation alone does most of the work because the pattern depends on being unnoticed, and it loses efficiency once it has been seen. What you will find over some weeks is that the count drops, not because you tried harder, but because a thing that is being watched becomes harder to do automatically. And what that produces over months is a person who has different requirements without having decided to have them. The requirements return on their own once the suppression mechanism is interrupted, in the same way that a filter recalibrates once you stop overriding it. That is the actual work of this period, not understanding them better. You already understand them completely, interrupting the version of them that you carried out of the relationship and installed as a voice. What you have that they do not. There is an asymmetry in the aftermath that runs entirely in your favor, and it is not obvious from where you are standing. You have a complete account. You were the one paying attention, so you came out of this with the full record, including the parts they never registered. That account is unpleasant to hold right now, and it is enormously valuable in the long run, because a complete account is what makes a pattern non-repeatable. They do not have that. They have a partial version, assembled from limited data, missing exactly the material that would be most useful. They will not learn what you learned, because learning it would require the sustained self-examination that the pattern exists to prevent. You also have the exit. Whatever happened, you are on the outside of a configuration, they are still inside. The pattern is a property of them, and it travels, and it will operate in the new relationship on its own schedule, and they will experience it as something happening to them rather than as something they are doing, because that is how it has always been experienced. You are not waiting for that. You do not need it. It is simply the accurate description of a situation you are no longer in. And you have the capacity itself, uncontaminated. The attunement, the patience, the ability to stay present with someone difficult, the enormous tolerance for complexity. All of that is real ability, developed under difficult conditions, and it belongs to you regardless of where it was learned. Pointed at someone who reciprocates, it is the thing that makes you an extraordinary partner rather than an exhausted one. That is not a consolation prize. It is a substantially better position than the one you were in a year ago, purchased at a very high price, non-refundable, and entirely yours. One correction about the word chose. People use the word chose about this, and the word does most of the damage, so it deserves one final pass. They chose someone else. That is how it is phrased, and phrased that way it implies a comparison, a weighing, a moment in which two options were held up against each other and one was selected. Nothing like that occurred. There was no moment. You were not in the room when whatever happened happened, and neither, in any meaningful sense, were you in their consideration, because considerations of that kind are not how these outcomes are produced. What occurred was a sequence of small, unremarkable events under a particular set of conditions, none of which involved you, spread across months, resulting in a situation that then got a name attached to it. The name makes it look like a decision. It was an accumulation. Replace chose with ended up in and read the sentence again. They ended up committed to someone else. That version is more accurate, and it has almost none of the sting, and the difference between the two versions is not a difference in the facts. It is a difference in whether an intentional agent is being imagined comparing you to somebody. No one compared you to anybody. That comparison exists in exactly one place, which is your own head, where you have been running it continuously since you found out, against a person you have constructed out of your own worst assumptions about yourself. Stop running it, not because you will win. Because there is no contest, there never was one, and the entire event you are grieving is one you have partly built yourself out of a word that does not apply. The last thing about the real reason. The title of this asks for the real reason, and it deserves a final answer stated as directly as possible. The real reason they committed to someone else is that commitment, for a person like this, is not produced by the depth of a connection. It is produced by the absence of enough pressure to trigger the defense, which means that in this specific population, and only in this population, the relationships most likely to be formalized are frequently not the ones that went deepest. You went deepest. That is the actual finding. Everything that happened is consistent with that, and almost nothing is consistent with the alternative, and the alternative is the one your mind has been running because it is the simplest available story, and because it fits a belief you were carrying long before you met them. That belief is the thing to work on, not the relationship, which is over. Not their choices, which are theirs. The old sentence about yourself that this event confirmed, which was already there, and which was installed long ago by someone else, and which has now found a very convincing piece of evidence to attach itself to. That sentence is what actually needs to be dismantled, and dismantling it is not accomplished by winning an argument about this particular relationship. It is accomplished slowly, through the accumulation of experiences in which you are treated well by people who are capable of it, until the weight of the new evidence exceeds the weight of the old. That is available. It starts whenever you stop checking. They committed to someone else. That is a fact about their life. It happened for reasons that live entirely inside a system you did not build and could not have changed. Your life is a separate thing, currently paused, waiting for you to come back to it. It has been waiting for years.